Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If military history and current affairs are part of your serious preparation, then you're exactly where you need to be. This channel is your one-stop solution for military history, current affairs, and the science and military technology that connects both. On this channel, we do not just provide videos. We also prepare detailed PDF notes designed to help you understand concepts clearly and retain them for the long term. Our entire focus is simple: make learning easier, structured, and exam-oriented. Now friends, today's episode is extremely important. We are going to discuss the 2023 question paper. Many of you already know that the same campaign that appeared in 2023 is repeating this year as well. The interesting coincidence is that the same book has been prescribed again. This is not something you should ignore. I'm sure most of you have already managed answers from open sources. But the real question is this: why are notes different? And how can they help you score those extra marks? Here is the key difference. After every single answer, we clearly link the content with its relevance to unrestricted warfare. This is where most answers fail, and this is exactly where marks are gained. In this episode, we will be discussing only 10 selected questions. But each one will be covered in a way that helps you write better, sharper, and more relevant answers in the exam. If you have not yet booked our notes, you can call on the number displayed on your screen. And for those of you who have already booked, here's an update for you. Our team is preparing a chapter-wise question bank, and you will receive it by the end of March in soft copy format. No hard copy will be provided. Now friends, without wasting any time, let us begin. We will start with question number 1, which appeared in the 2023 military history paper. If you find this video helpful, do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us reach more serious aspirants like you. Alright friends, let's begin with question number 1. Question number 1 states, on 7th November 1950, Sardar Patel provided a masterly appreciation of the situation on India's northern borders in a letter to the Prime Minister. Discuss the problems which, in his opinion, required an early solution. Analyze and comment on critical suggestions made by Sardar Patel and action taken by Prime Minister. Let us first understand why this letter was written. Strategic context of the letter. The letter came immediately after the People's Liberation Army occupied Tibet. Until then, Tibet had acted as a natural buffer between India and China. With its laws, India suddenly found itself sharing a long and exposed land boundary with a powerful and ideologically driven neighbor. Patel was quick to recognize that China's diplomatic language of friendship did not match its actions on the ground. In his view, this was not reassurance. It was a warning sign. Now let us move to the problems which Sardar Patel believed required early solution. Problems identified by Sardar Patel. The first and most serious problem was the loss of Tibet as a strategic buffer. For centuries, Tibet had insulated India from direct military pressure. Once Chinese forces reached Tibet, the Himalayas could no longer be treated as an impenetrable shield. India now faced a continuous and vulnerable northern frontier. Closely linked to this was Patel's concern about Chinese intentions. He found China's response to India's protest dismissive and accusatory. Patel clearly stated that policy based on goodwill and rhetoric was dangerous. In his assessment, Chinese assurances of peaceful intent were unreliable. The third issue was boundary vulnerability. Patel warned that existing boundary arrangements would not be respected once China consolidated its hold over Tibet. He foresaw future claims over NEFA and other border areas, even though no dispute existed at that time. Another critical concern was military unpreparedness. Indian forces were neither trained nor deployed for high-altitude warfare. Strategic planning remained focused almost entirely on Pakistan, while the northern threat was ignored. There was no realistic assessment of force requirements along the Himalayan frontier. Finally, Patel highlighted infrastructure and logistical weakness. Border areas lacked roads, railways, airfields, and reliable communications. Troops could not be moved quickly nor sustained for long durations. In a mountainous theater, this weakness was strategically crippling. Having identified the problems, Patel then offered clear and practical suggestions. Critical suggestions made by Sardar Patel. First, he called for a strategic defense reappraisal. Patel wanted an immediate reassessment of India's defense posture along the northern borders. He recognized China as a long-term strategic challenge and urged a shift from political optimism to military realism. Second, he stressed the urgent development of border infrastructure. Roads, communications, and air links were essential to support forward-deployed forces. Patel emphasized depth and endurance rather than symbolic military presence. Third, Patel advised the maintenance of forward presence. He supported retaining India's diplomatic and political presence in Lhasa and maintaining military posts along traditional trade and communication routes. Presence, according to him, was necessary to retain influence and situational awareness. Finally, he recommended a diplomatic reorientations. Patel questioned unconditional diplomatic support to China and argued that foreign policy must align with national security interests. Ideology, he warned, should not override strategic caution. Now the key question: what action did the Prime Minister take? Action taken by the Prime Minister. In response to the letter, the Prime Minister did take immediate administrative measures. A committee was formed to examine the defense and security of the northern and northeastern borders. Patel's concerns were acknowledged at the procedural level. However, there were serious limitations in implementation. The recommendations did not result in sustained military buildup. Infrastructure development remained slow and uneven. India continued to rely heavily on diplomacy and the belief in peaceful coexistence. More importantly, there was an absence of strategic shift. There was no fundamental change in defense doctrine or force posture. Patel's warnings were not institutionalized into long-term planning, leading to reactive and ad hoc responses in later years. Analysis and comment. Patel's appreciation displayed extraordinary strategic foresight rooted in geography and power politics. His warnings accurately anticipated China's future claims and behavior. The failure lay not in understanding the threat, but in execution. The gap between awareness and action shaped the strategic conditions that eventually led to the 1962 conflict. So, officers, we now come to the end of this question. I hope the logic and flow of the answer is clear to all of you. Before we move on to the next question, it is very important to connect this answer with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, because this is exactly what you are expected to do in the examination. In the examination, when you link such answers to unrestricted warfare, always remember this point. War does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the mind, in policy choices, and in long-term strategic neglect. Relevance to unrestricted warfare. From an Indian perspective, war was viewed narrowly as armed conflict. Political, psychological, and perception-based pressure were not treated as elements of warfare. Peace was assumed based on diplomatic language. From the Chinese perspective, strategic gains were achieved without direct military confrontation. Diplomacy and reassurance were used to mask long-term intentions, delaying Indian countermeasures. The core lesson is clear. Warfare begins long before the first shot is fired. Perception management can be as decisive as military force. Seeking rules of victory. India treated diplomacy and defense as separate spheres. China used political engagement to buy time, consolidate positions, and create facts on the ground. The ultimate lesson is that victory lies not merely in defeating forces, but in undermining the opponent's strategic position before conflict even begins. That completes question number 1. Now, friends, let us smoothly move to question number 2. Question 2 states, Battle of Walong was the most significant battle of Lohit Valley in 1962. Describe the following with specific reference to Battle of Walong. A. Terrain in Walong Kibithu sector. B. build-up and deployment of Indian and Chinese forces. C. Operations by 6 Kumon. The Battle of Walong was the most significant engagement in the Lohit Valley during the 1962 conflict. It was also the only sector in NEFA where India attempted a sustained and organized defense. Let us examine this battle under the 3 specified heads. Strategic context of the Battle of Walong, friends. Walong was located at the eastern extremity of NEFA in the Lohit Frontier Division. Control of this sector directly influenced access to the Lohit-Brahmaputra axis and, beyond that, the Assam Plains. Unlike other sectors, Walong witnessed a deliberate effort to hold ground and fight. For this reason, it represents India's last major resistance before the overall collapse in NEFA. Now let us first look at the terrain, because at Walong, terrain dictated everything. A. Terrain in the Walong-Kibithu sector. The Walong-Kibithu sector is mountainous and heavily forested, characterized by steep ridgelines and deep river valleys. The Lohit River and its tributaries dominate the area, creating natural obstacles and severely restricting movement. Lateral movement was extremely limited. Troop movement was canalized along narrow tracks and spurs, making logistics and reinforcement slow and predictable. Kibithu was the forwardmost post, located close to the McMahon line. While symbolically important, it was tactically exposed and difficult to support. The Walong Ball itself was a shallow basin surrounded by dominating heights. Features such as the Ashi Hill Complex, Yellow Pimple, Green Pimple, and West Ridge overlooked the Walong airstrip and supply zones. The key tactical implication was this: the terrain favored defenders who held the heights, not those occupying valley floors. Indian deployment in low-lying areas nullified the natural defensive advantage, while Chinese control of heights enabled observation, artillery fire, and infiltration. With this terrain reality in mind, let us now examine the build-up and deployment of forces. B. Build-up and deployment of Indian and Chinese forces. The Indian position at Walong was initially held by Assam Rifles and small regular units. Forward deployment to Kibithu further weakened the main defenses around Walong. Reinforcements were inducted piecemeal, largely by air and on foot, under severe logistical constraints. Indian troops suffered from shortages of ammunition, artillery support, winter clothing, and communication equipment. More critically, dominating heights were left unoccupied. Posts were isolated, lacked mutual support, and command and control remained weak throughout the battle. In contrast, the Chinese build-up was systematic and deliberate. Preparations had been carried out well in advance, with tracks and supply bases developed from Rima and the Ashi Hill area. Chinese forces occupied dominating heights overlooking Walong, established strong artillery positions, and deployed infantry in a coordinated manner. Their logistics, communications, and observation were vastly superior, allowing them to apply pressure along multiple axes. Now let us move to the heart of the battle, the actions of 6 Kumon. C. Operations by 6 Kumon. 6 Kumon was inducted as the main fighting unit at Walong and tasked to hold the Walong Ball and check the Chinese advance. The battalion operated under extreme logistical limitations yet maintained high morale and cohesion. In the initial phase, 6 Kumon successfully held its positions and repelled repeated Chinese attacks despite isolation and lack of support. These defensive actions imposed unexpected costs on the Chinese and demonstrated the fighting quality of Indian troops. Subsequently, the battalion was ordered to carry out counterattacks to regain lost heights. While some limited local success was achieved, the absence of artillery support and inability to hold captured ground made these gains unsustainable. In the final phase, Chinese artillery fire and infiltration tactics gradually isolated Indian positions. Once the defense became untenable, a withdrawal was ordered. 6 Kumon conducted the withdrawal under heavy pressure, maintaining discipline despite adverse conditions. Assessment of the Battle of Walong. The battle clearly demonstrated that Indian troops fought with courage, determination, and tactical skill. The failure at Walong was not due to lack of fighting spirit, but due to higher-level shortcomings in planning, logistics, and terrain appreciation. Chinese success rested on preparation, control of key terrain, and integrated application of combat power. At the same time, Walong imposed significant costs on the Chinese and disrupted their operational timetable. So officers, here we come to the end of Answer 2. Now let us clearly connect this battle with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, because this linkage is critical in your examination. From the Indian side, the Battle of Walong was largely treated as a conventional infantry engagement. Terrain, logistics, intelligence, and operations were handled in isolation. As a result, even brave and well-led troops could not translate tactical resistance into operational success. The Chinese approach was fundamentally different. Logistics, terrain domination, infiltration, artillery, and timing were fused into a single operational design. Pressure was applied continuously across multiple axes, keeping Indian forces off balance and denying them the ability to regroup or adapt. The core lesson is straightforward. Modern warfare is multi-domain and integrated. Success lies in combining multiple methods into one coherent strategy, not in fighting each element separately. This directly leads us to the new methodology of war games. The Indian approach was marked by unrealistic assumptions, reactive planning, and frequent command changes, which disrupted continuity and adaptability. In contrast, the Chinese adjusted their tactics based on Indian responses, controlled the tempo of operations, and exploited emerging weaknesses. The lesson for us is decisive. Adaptability and control of tempo are just as important as numbers and firepower. So officers, with this understanding of the Battle of Walong, let us now move forward to the next question. That is question number 3. Question number 3 states, the authors of Unrestricted Warfare state that modern conflict is no longer limited to the traditional boundaries of war and peace, and that war can be waged through political, economic, informational, and psychological means without formal declaration. A. Discuss the concept of unrestricted warfare as articulated by the authors. B. Analyze and list the non-military and grey zone activities being undertaken by China in the prevailing geopolitical, cyber-info warfare and military dominance against India, in line with the concept of unrestricted warfare. Friends, this question is different one from 2023 paper, because in that year the question was from 3 strategic warfare. So let us discuss this question. The authors of Unrestricted Warfare argue that modern conflict is no longer confined to declared wars or traditional battlefields. War today can be waged through political, economic, informational, and psychological means, often without a formal declaration. Let us address this question in 2 parts. A. Concept of unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare represents a clear departure from traditional concepts of war. According to the authors, war is no longer limited to periods of declared hostilities. The distinction between war and peace has become blurred, making conflict continuous, subtle, and often undeclared. The battle space has expanded far beyond the military domain. Warfare now extends into political, economic, financial, legal, informational, and psychological spheres. Civilian systems such as markets, media, institutions, and public opinion become legitimate targets. Strategic objectives can be achieved without fighting a conventional battle. A central feature of unrestricted warfare is the absence of fixed rules and limits. There are no prohibited methods or domains. Military and non-military tools are applied simultaneously, and considerations of legality or morality are secondary to effectiveness. The objective is not battlefield victory, but compulsion. The aim is to force the adversary to accept one's interests by undermining national will, internal cohesion, and decision-making capacity. Victory is achieved by shaping conditions rather than fighting decisive engagements. Let's move ahead and understand about 3 core principles define unrestricted warfare. Let us first understand it one by one. The first is asymmetry. Instead of confronting strengths, the opponent's vulnerabilities are exploited. Cost-effective methods are used to impose disproportionate damage while avoiding direct confrontation. The second principle is integration. Political, economic, informational, and military tools are synchronized to maintain constant pressure, without crossing thresholds that trigger full-scale war. The third principle is psychological dominance. Perceptions of intent, capability, and resolve are shaped to create doubt, confusion, and hesitation. Ideally, the enemy does not even realize that war is being waged. With this conceptual foundation, we can now analyze how China applies unrestricted warfare against India. B. Non-military and grey zone activities undertaken by China against India political and diplomatic domain. China consistently projects an image of peaceful intent while applying pressure on the ground. Dialogue mechanisms and agreements are used to manage escalation rather than resolve disputes. At the international level, disputes are framed as bilateral and manageable, limiting external involvement. Legal ambiguity is deliberately maintained through selective interpretation of historical claims and rejection of inherited boundary arrangements. This sustains long-term pressure without formal escalation. Economic domain. China leverages trade asymmetry to create economic dependence in critical sectors. Supply chains and manufacturing vulnerabilities are used as strategic pressure points. At the regional level, infrastructure and connectivity projects in India's neighborhood generate economic dependencies, contributing to strategic encirclement and influence without military presence. Next, we will talk about information and psychological warfare, friends. China persistently shapes narratives by portraying itself as restrained and defensive while projecting the inevitability of its power and endurance. Its own actions are downplayed, while Indian responses are amplified to depict escalation. Sustained low-level pressure normalizes Chinese actions and tests Indian thresholds. Over time, this induces strategic fatigue, hesitation, and decision paralysis. Moving next, let's talk about cyber and information warfare. China engages in continuous cyber probing of networks and digital infrastructure, targeting information systems rather than physical assets. These activities remain below the threshold of open conflict. Information operations are aimed at influencing public opinion and decision-makers, exploiting social and political divisions, and blurring the line between civilian and military information spaces. Military domain, grey zone operations. In the military sphere, China applies incremental territorial actions. Forward movement is gradual, avoiding large-scale combat while creating new ground realities through patrols, infrastructure, and logistics. Escalation is carefully controlled through the use of non-lethal force and localized engagements. This maintains initiative while denying India justification for full-scale retaliation. Friends, if you have understood this answer, please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. One simple way to judge the quality of your preparation is this. If the notes you are referring to help you answer these questions with clarity and confidence, then you can be sure your notes are solid. If you are struggling to frame these answers, then it is time to update your notes. For those who want structured, exam-oriented PDF notes that connect concepts with operational relevance, you can book our notes by calling the number flashed on your screen. Do call and book your PDF now. Once again, please like, share, and subscribe. And with that, let us move on to question number 4. Question number 4 states, setting up of the Zang-Zi 419 force by Central Military Commission CMC on 11th June 1962 after the push and shove incident at Khenjamane is termed as a turning point in the Sino-Indian confrontation. In this regard, discuss the following. A. Details and officer in charge of the military force. B. Order issued by Forward Headquarter Tibet Military Command on 18th October 1960 to all 3 units. C. three attack options available to Zang-Zi 419 force for attacking Indian positions. The setting up of the Zang-Zi 419 force by the Central Military Commission on 11 June 1962, immediately after the push and shove incident at Khenjamane, marks a clear turning point in the Sino-Indian confrontation. Up to this point, China was still operating in the space of political signaling. With the creation of this force, the confrontation shifted decisively from diplomacy to planned military action. Let us examine this under the three given heads. First, let's talk about background and its significance. Friends, the Zang-Zi 419 force was not an ad hoc formation. It was China's first formal, theater-level offensive structure created specifically to deal with India. Its formation demonstrated a clear intent. The boundary issue would no longer be managed through talks alone. It would be resolved by force if required. Now let us begin with Part A. Details and officer in charge of the Zang-Zi 419 force. The Zang-Zi 419 force was a specially constituted task force raised under the authority of the Central Military Commission. It was drawn from formations of the Tibet Military Command and designed for coordinated, multi-sector offensive operations. The force included infantry units, artillery, engineers, logistics, and communications elements, allowing it to operate independently and sustain offensive action. Command and control were deliberately centralized. The force was placed under direct higher military authority, bypassing routine chains of command. This ensured political and military objectives remained tightly aligned. The force was commanded by a senior PLA officer reporting to the Tibet Military Command and operating under the direct guidance of the Central Military Commission. His task was clear: plan and execute offensive operations against Indian positions in NEFA. With the force in place, the next decisive step came in October 1962. B. Order issued by Forward Headquarter, Tibet Military Command on 18 October 1962. On 18 October 1962, Forward Headquarters of the Tibet Military Command issued a clear and unambiguous order to all three operational units under the Zang-Zi 419 force. This order removed all remaining ambiguity about Chinese intentions. The directive was to launch coordinated offensive operations at first light, achieving surprise, speed, and decisiveness. The objective was not merely to capture ground, but to destroy Indian combat capability. Units were instructed to prevent Indian forces from regrouping or withdrawing in good order. Simultaneous pressure was to be applied across sectors to overload Indian command and control. Most importantly, military conduct was to remain tightly linked to political objectives, ensuring escalation remained controlled while operational results were decisive. Now let us examine the three attack options available to the Zang-Zi 419 force. C. Three attack options available to Zang-Zi 419 force. The first option was a frontal attack. This involved a direct assault along the Nam-Ka-Chu axis, aimed at fixing Indian troops and pinning them in place. While costly, this option offered immediate psychological shock. The second option was a flanking attack. Chinese forces would move along the eastern and western heights, bypassing Indian strong points and striking rear areas. This approach aimed to cut off supply lines and withdrawal routes. The third and preferred option was encirclement and annihilation. This combined frontal pressure with deep flanking maneuvers to isolate Indian units completely before delivering the final blow. This option minimized PLA casualties while ensuring certainty of success. This choice of options reflects a mindset focused not on heroic battles, but on decisive outcomes. So, friends, with this, we have completed our answer of question 4. But for an added advantage, we will connect this part also with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, relevance to unrestricted warfare, 10,000 methods combined as one. From the Indian side, military, political, and informational domains were handled in silos. China, in contrast, integrated force creation, political control, deception, timing, and operational design into a single strategy. The Zang-Zi 419 force was not just a military formation. It was a political military instrument. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is clear. Integration is the decisive factor. Seeking rules of victory. India focused on holding ground, reacting to events, and adhering to norms. China focused on destroying capability, cohesion, and decision-making while avoiding unnecessary battles. The lesson here is fundamental. Victory lies in clarity of objectives and the methodical application of force, not in tactical rigidity. So officers, with this understanding of the Zang-Zi 419 force and its role as a turning point in 1962, let us now move forward to the next question, that is question number 5. Question 5 states, what is Panchsheel Agreement? Analyze how this agreement benefited the Chinese and proved to be disadvantageous to India. Officers, this question is important because it shows how diplomacy, when detached from strategy, can quietly reshape the balance of power. Let us break this answer into 2 parts. First, what is the Panchsheel Agreement? The Panchsheel Agreement was signed in 1954 between India and China. Formally, it was known as the Agreement on Trade and Intercourse with Tibet. The agreement was built around the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence known as Panchsheel. These principles were mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Politically, this agreement carried major significance. India formally accepted Chinese sovereignty over Tibet, replacing inherited British-era arrangements. The agreement reflected India's belief in idealistic diplomacy, Asian solidarity, and the hope that moral principles could prevent conflict. Now let us examine how this agreement benefited China. How Panchsheel benefited China. The first major benefit was diplomatic legitimacy. India's recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet strengthened China's international position. It reduced resistance to Chinese control and undermined Tibetan autonomy without the use of military force. Second, Panchsheel gave China strategic freedom. India gave up its special rights and presence in Tibet. This allowed China unrestricted access to the region, enabling the construction of roads, logistics networks, and military infrastructure close to India's borders. Third, the agreement bought China time for consolidation. The rhetoric of peace lowered India's threat perception. During this period, China quietly built military capability and infrastructure in Tibet without facing Indian countermeasures. Finally, Panchsheel provided a narrative advantage. China projected itself as peaceful and cooperative, positioning India as a partner rather than a competitor. This masked long-term strategic intent and delayed Indian strategic responses. Now let us look at the other side of the equation, how Panchsheel disadvantaged India. The most serious loss for India was the loss of Tibet as a strategic buffer. Once Tibet ceased to exist as an autonomous space, India acquired a direct and exposed border with China. Strategic depth in the Himalayas was lost permanently. Next came an intelligence and presence vacuum. India withdrew its missions and posts from Tibet, resulting in a sharp decline in situational awareness. Early warning of Chinese military activity was effectively lost. Another major disadvantage was boundary ambiguity. The agreement avoided an explicit settlement of the border. China later denied recognition of inherited boundaries, enabling future claims in NEFA and Ladakh. Finally, Panchsheel encouraged strategic complacency. It reinforced the belief that war with China was unlikely. Defense preparedness along the northern borders was neglected, and military planning became subordinate to diplomatic optimism. Officers, let's connect this part with unrestricted warfare. This agreement fits directly into the framework of unrestricted warfare. Chapter: The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first. India relied on diplomacy as a substitute for military preparedness and neglected infrastructure and logistics. China used diplomacy as a strategic weapon. under the cover of peace, it built military and logistical capacity. The lesson is clear. Preparation always precedes confrontation. The war gods phase has become indistinct. India viewed peace and war as separate conditions. Agreements were assumed to guarantee stability. China operated in the grey zone between peace and war, advancing strategic objectives without fighting. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is simple but powerful. War can be waged without battles. So officers, the Panchsheel Agreement stands as a textbook example of how ideals, when unbacked by power, can quietly shift the strategic balance. With that, let us now move forward to the next question, that is question number 6. Question 6 states, discuss the two important and overwhelming facts that the Indian government failed to recognize on the Chinese invasion of Tibet. What were the comments of DSSC Commandant Gen Kaul on the Indian response to Chinese action? Friends, the Chinese invasion of Tibet was one of the most decisive strategic events in India's post-independence history. Yet, at the political and strategic level, the Indian government failed to recognize two overwhelming facts. These missed realities shaped India's vulnerability in the years that followed. Let us examine them one by one, and then look at the sharp comments made by DSSC Commandant General W.D.A. Lenton. First, let us look at strategic context. The Chinese military occupation of Tibet fundamentally altered India's security environment. For the first time, India faced a powerful continental state directly across the Himalayas. Despite this shift, India's response remained diplomatic and restrained, even though the military implications were clear. Moving next, let us talk about first overwhelming fact missed. Tibet was the key to India's northern security. For centuries, Tibet had functioned as a strategic buffer between India and China. Its existence kept Chinese military power at a distance. Once Tibet was lost, India no longer had a remote frontier. The northern boundary became immediate and exposed. The Indian government failed to appreciate this transformation. Tibet was treated as a peripheral political issue rather than a core national security concern. There was an assumption that geography alone would deter military action. Most critically, India did not recognize that control of Tibet meant control of the approach routes into India. Next, let us look at second overwhelming fact missed: Chinese military intent and capability. The PLA invasion of Tibet clearly demonstrated China's willingness to use military force to achieve political objectives. It also revealed China's capacity for long-term strategic planning. Tibet gave China the space to develop roads, logistics, and forward military infrastructure in depth, something India did not counter. However, the Indian government assumed that China would be satisfied after annexing Tibet. Tibet was not seen as a springboard for future pressure on India. Ideological affinity and belief in peaceful coexistence continued to dominate strategic thinking even as military realities changed. Let us look at the consequences of these failures. Officers, the result was the loss of strategic depth and early warning. India's northern borders remained poorly mapped, lightly defended, and logistically weak. Military preparedness did not match the new threat environment, creating the conditions for strategic surprise in later years. Moving next, let's talk about comments of DSSC Commandant General W.D.A. Lenton. General Lenton was blunt in his assessment of India's response. He described it as passive and unrealistic, pointing out the absence of contingency planning despite a major strategic shift. His core criticism was the widening gap between political optimism and military reality. India failed to respond with urgency, and defense policy was not aligned with emerging threats. Implicit in his comments was a warning. Delay in preparation would only increase future costs, and failure to act early would deny India favorable strategic options. At last, let us connect this part with the relevance of unrestricted warfare. Relevance to unrestricted warfare. Chapter: The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first. India treated Tibet primarily as a political issue and failed to anticipate its military implications. Infrastructure and force development were neglected. China, by contrast, used military force to create lasting strategic advantage, transforming Tibet into a logistics and staging base. The lesson is simple. Control of space and logistics comes before battlefield victory. 10,000 methods combined as one. India separated diplomacy from defense planning. China integrated military action with long-term political strategy, aligning territorial control with future operational objectives. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is clear. Modern conflict is defined by integration of power across domains. So officers, the failure to recognize these two realities after the invasion of Tibet stands as a classic example of how strategic blindness can shape future conflict. With that, let us now move forward to the next question. Question number 7. It states, by 1957, Pandit Nehru began to appreciate dangers to our northern borders as well as the threat from Pakistan. Analyze the two alternatives that were available to him and comment on the option chosen. What were the Chinese actions during the same period? Officers, by 1957, Pandit Nehru had begun to appreciate the dangers developing along India's northern borders, along with the continuing threat from Pakistan in the west. This created a strategic dilemma with two clear alternatives. Let us analyze these options, the choice he made, and what China was doing during the same period. Officers hope you are able to correlate with the study material. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to book our notes, feel free to call on the number shown on the screen. Let's move ahead. At the outset, let us start with strategic context, 1957. Officers, by 1957, China had completed the Aksai-Chin Road, linking Xinjiang with Tibet. This transformed Chinese presence across the Himalayas from temporary to permanent and militarily relevant. India now faced a dual challenge: China in the north and Pakistan in the west. Nehru recognized these threats, but his response was shaped by political priorities, economic constraints, and ideological beliefs. Moving ahead, let us look at two strategic alternatives available to Pandit Nehru. Alternative 1. Military preparedness and strategic hardening. The first option was to accept China as a long-term strategic adversary. This would have required accelerated military modernization, expansion of forces, and urgent development of border infrastructure, including roads, airfields, and logistics. Territorial claims would need to be clearly defined and defended, with resources balanced between the China and Pakistan fronts. However, this option carried costs. It required diverting funds from economic development, risked damaging India's image as a peace-oriented state, and could have provoked early confrontation with China. Alternative 2. Political diplomatic management of threats. The second option was to manage threats primarily through diplomacy and political engagement. This approach relied on dialogue, international norms, peaceful coexistence, and Asian solidarity. Defense expenditure was kept limited to prioritize economic growth, and China and Pakistan were handled separately through political channels. In the short term, this reduced military and economic burden and preserved India's moral standing internationally. But it rested on the assumption that adversaries would act with restraint and reciprocity. Moving next, let us look at the option chosen by Pandit Nehru. Nehru chose the political diplomatic approach. He continued to emphasize Panchsheel and non-alignment. Defense expansion and border infrastructure development remained limited, and military preparedness did not keep pace with threat perception. As a result, India's response became reactive rather than preventive. Border areas stayed weakly defended and poorly connected, even as strategic risks increased. Moving next, let's see the Chinese actions during the same period, 1955 to 1959. Officers, while India relied on diplomacy, China followed a very different path: strategic and military consolidation. China completed the Xinjiang-Tibet Road, built tracks, supply bases, and forward logistics nodes, and enabled rapid troop movement and sustainment. PLA presence across Tibet was strengthened, acclimatization improved, and patrols and surveys were conducted in disputed areas. Next is about political and diplomatic masking. At the same time, China continued the rhetoric of friendship and peaceful coexistence. Boundary issues were downplayed publicly, even as ground realities were changed quietly. China rejected inherited boundary alignments and selectively articulated historical claims, maintaining ambiguity to preserve freedom of action. So officers, before we move ahead, let us finally connect this answer with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, because this is exactly the linkage expected from you in the examination. Chapter: Seeking Rules of Victory. India expected restraint, reciprocity, and respect for norms. China focused on altering the strategic balance, creating facts on the ground regardless of rules. The lesson is clear. Victory is achieved by shaping conditions, not by following norms alone. 10,000 methods combined as one. India separated diplomacy, defense, and infrastructure planning, lacking an integrated national security strategy. China integrated political reassurance with military preparation, using diplomacy to shield strategic consolidation. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is decisive. Integration across domains determines outcomes. So officers, by 1957, while India debated choices, China quietly executed a coherent strategy. That contrast explains much of what followed. With that, let us now move forward to the next question. Question number 8, which states, after the clash at Zhangzhou, General Kaul briefed the Defense Committee of Cabinet, DCC, on 11 October 1962 on the prevailing situation at Dhola. What issues did Gen Kaul point out to the DCC? Analyze and comment on the choices offered by Gen Kaul to the DCC in the prevailing situation. Officers, after the clash at Zhangzhou, General B. M. Kaul briefed the Defense Committee of Cabinet on 11 October 1962 regarding the situation at Dhola Post. This briefing is critical because it exposed the gap between military reality and political expectations on the eve of the war. Let us first understand the situation, then the issues highlighted by Gen Kaul, and finally analyze the choices he placed before the DCC. First, let us look at strategic context of Dhola Post. The clash at Zhangzhou confirmed that Chinese opposition to India's forward deployments was no longer symbolic. It was active and escalating. Dhola Post lay south of the McMahon Line, but it was tactically dominated by the Chinese-held Thagla Ridge. Indian troops were deployed in the valley along the Nam Kachu, while Chinese forces occupied the heights. At the same time, strong political pressure existed to uphold the forward policy, even though military conditions on the ground were unfavorable. Now let us see the issues highlighted by General Kaul to the DCC. First, tactical disadvantage at Dhola. Gen Kaul clearly pointed out that Indian troops were deployed in a tactically untenable position. The Chinese held dominating heights on Thagla Ridge, giving them complete observation, fire control, and the ability to envelop Indian positions. Indian troops in the valley lacked depth, cover, and maneuver space. The implication was straightforward. Any Chinese attack launched from the heights would be decisive. Next, logistical and administrative constraints, officers. Dhola was dependent almost entirely on air supply and porters. Ammunition holdings were limited, artillery shells were scarce, and winter clothing was inadequate. Poor tracks, weather, and terrain severely restricted sustainment. Reinforcements could only be inducted slowly and in small numbers. Artillery deployment was extremely constrained. In short, the position could not be supported for prolonged combat. Third is about firepower and support deficiencies. Indian artillery was inadequate both in number and caliber. Guns could not be optimally positioned due to terrain. Air support was politically constrained and operationally uncertain. In contrast, Chinese artillery on the heights enjoyed clear dominance. Indian troops lacked counter-battery capability, leaving them highly vulnerable. Lastly, we will talk about Chinese military posture. Gen Kaul also highlighted that Chinese troops were well entrenched on Thagla Ridge, with clear signs of preparation for offensive action. Patrols were aggressive and probing. His assessment was that Chinese intent was firm and escalating. The situation was no longer a localized standoff. Moving ahead from the question, it also asked about choices offered by Gen Kaul to the DCC. Friends, against this backdrop, Gen Kaul placed 3 choices before the Defense Committee of Cabinet. Option 1. Withdraw from Dhola. The first option was to withdraw Indian troops to tactically defensible positions south of the Namkachu. From a military perspective, this was the soundest option. It reduced the risk of encirclement and destruction. However, politically it was unacceptable. It was seen as loss of face and a retreat under pressure. Option 2. Hold Dhola defensively. The second option was to maintain the existing deployment and avoid provocation, hoping the Chinese would not escalate. This was a militarily weak option. It left troops exposed to attack from dominating heights and relied entirely on Chinese restraint rather than Indian capability. Option 3. Evict the Chinese from Thagla Ridge. The third option was to launch an offensive to seize Thagla Ridge and restore tactical balance. While attractive politically, this option was militarily unrealistic. Logistics, terrain, artillery support, and force levels were insufficient. It rested on optimistic assumptions that the Chinese would not react forcefully. This choice reflected political pressure rather than battlefield reality. So officers, now let us clearly link this episode with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, because this is exactly where this case fits perfectly. Chapter: The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first. India chose action without adequate logistics, firepower, or sustainment. China ensured domination of terrain, logistics, and artillery before engagement. The lesson is clear. Material preparation determines outcomes, not intent or resolve. The war gods phase has become indistinct. India treated crisis management as peacetime signaling, assuming restraint would continue. China prepared for war while talks and posturing continued, deliberately blurring the line between peace and war. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is stark. War advances even when diplomacy appears active. So officers, the Dhola episode and Gen Kaul's briefing stand as a powerful example of how political optimism, when disconnected from military reality, can shape disastrous outcomes. With that, let us now move forward to the next question. Question number 9 states, analyze the doctrines and tactics adopted by the Chinese during the 1962 war. Friends, the 1962 war was not a series of accidental border clashes. It was a planned, limited war, executed by China to achieve political and strategic objectives. Understanding the doctrines and tactics adopted by the Chinese explains why the campaign unfolded the way it did. Let us analyze this in 2 parts. First, let us talk about strategic context. Chinese operations in 1960 were designed to deliver a sharp military shock, compel political acceptance, and then disengage. The objective was coercion, not territorial conquest or prolonged conflict. This clarity of purpose shaped both doctrine and tactics. Chinese doctrines adopted during the 1962 war. First, let us look at doctrine of limited war for political objectives. China fought with clearly defined political aims. The intention was not to occupy territory indefinitely, but to use force to impose strategic terms. Escalation was carefully controlled, and once objectives were achieved, a ceasefire was declared. Next, doctrine of initiative and surprise. China retained complete control over the timing, place, and scale of operations. Attacks were launched simultaneously across multiple sectors, denying Indian forces time to react, reinforce, or reorganize. 3. Doctrine of fighting on one's own terms. Engagements were undertaken only when tactical and logistical superiority was assured. The PLA avoided premature or unfavorable battles and applied force selectively, ensuring maximum effect at minimum cost. 4. Doctrine of integrated political military control. Military operations were conducted under tight political supervision. Battlefield actions were closely aligned with strategic messaging. The ceasefire itself was part of the campaign design, reinforcing political objectives. 5. Doctrine of annihilation over attrition. The focus was on destroying Indian combat capability, not wearing it down gradually. Encirclement, isolation, and collapse of units were prioritized, with psychological impact valued as much as physical destruction. Next, we will talk about the Chinese tactics employed during the war. 1. Tactical use of terrain. Chinese forces occupied dominating heights well before combat. Attacks were launched downhill against Indian troops deployed in valleys. Ridgelines, spurs, and nullahs were used for covered movement and concealment. 2. Infiltration and encirclement. Night movement and infiltration were used extensively. Strong points were bypassed rather than assaulted frontally. Supply routes and withdrawal paths were cut, isolating Indian units before engagement. 3. Artillery-centric operations. Artillery played a decisive role. Well-sited observation posts enabled accurate fire to soften Indian positions. Artillery was used to break morale before infantry assaults. 4. Multi-axis attacks. Simultaneous attacks from the front, flanks, and rear overwhelmed Indian command and control. This prevented coordinated defense or effective counterattacks. 5. Control of tempo. Operations followed a rhythm of rapid concentration, short violent engagements, and pauses. This maintained 6. Psychological dominance and uncertainty, keeping Indian forces off balance. Psychological pressure. Sudden escalation after prolonged calm created shock. Use of propaganda, bugles, and visible troop massing amplified fear and confusion, accelerating collapse of cohesion. Now friends, let us connect this with the lessons for unrestricted warfare, because this is the real takeaway from the 1962 conflict. Relevance to unrestricted warfare. Chapter: The Weapons Revolution, which invariably comes first. India entered combat without matching logistics or firepower and relied heavily on static infantry positions. China ensured superiority in logistics, artillery, and infrastructure well before fighting began. The lesson is direct. Material preparation determines victory before the battle starts. Seeking rules of victory. India attempted to hold ground symbolically even under unfavorable tactical conditions. China focused on destroying the enemy's ability to resist, choosing battles selectively rather than defending or capturing territory for its own sake. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is clear. Victory lies in breaking capability, not in holding ground. So officers, Chinese doctrines and tactics in 1960 to reflect a modern approach to war. Planned, integrated, and politically controlled. With this lesson firmly understood, let us now move ahead to the next and final question of this part. Question number 10 states, the annexation of Xinjiang by China in 1949 alerted India. By early 1950, China had made it amply clear that it intended to annex Tibet. What were the options before India to thwart the annexation of Tibet? Why was the military option not exercised? What were the implications of annexation of Tibet by China? Officers, the annexation of Xinjiang in 1949 brought China directly to India's doorstep in Ladakh. By early 1950, China made it amply clear that it intended to annex Tibet. At this critical moment, India faced a decisive strategic choice at the very beginning of its life as a republic. Let us examine the options available to India while the military option was not exercised, and the long-term implications of Tibet's annexation. First, let us look at strategic context. Friends, With China's control over Xinjiang, Tibet became central to India's northern security architecture. The Chinese intent was explicit and backed by military preparation. The question before India was not whether Tibet mattered, but how far India was willing to go to protect it. Moving ahead, let us look at options available to India to prevent or thwart the annexation of Tibet. Option 1. Diplomatic opposition and internationalization. India could have raised the Tibet issue at international forums and mobilized moral and political pressure against Chinese action. Coordination with major powers sympathetic to Tibetan autonomy was possible. However, India was hesitant to internationalize an Asian issue. There was reluctance to appear aligned with Western powers and a strong desire not to antagonize China diplomatically. Option 2. Political and material support to Tibet. Another option was to strengthen Tibetan resistance through political, administrative, and limited material support. Maintaining a strong Indian presence and influence in Lhasa could have delayed Chinese consolidation. This option required sustained commitment and clarity of intent. It also carried the risk of gradual escalation and demanded long-term political resolve, which India lacked at the time. Option 3. Military intervention or deterrent deployment. India could have deployed forces into Tibet as a deterrent, occupying key nodes such as Gyanse or Chando, and signaling readiness to oppose the PLA. Such a move might have delayed or complicated Chinese annexation, preserved Tibet as a buffer, and provided bargaining leverage. Moving ahead, let us see why the military option was not exercised. Military constraints. The Indian Army was already stretched due to commitments in Kashmir. There were no forces trained or equipped for high-altitude warfare, and logistics and infrastructure was severely inadequate. Sustaining troops deep inside Tibet was beyond India's capability. There was a real risk of isolation and defeat without assured external support. 2. Political and strategic considerations. Pandit Nehru's worldview was shaped by faith in peaceful coexistence and Asian solidarity. There was concern that military action would damage India's global image and moral leadership. Diplomatically, there was an expectation that China would show restraint and that negotiations could preserve Tibetan autonomy. Confrontation with the newly established People's Republic of China was deliberately avoided. 3. Institutional advice. Military leadership advised against intervention, assessing that any operation in Tibet could neither be sustained nor escalated successfully. Moving ahead, let us look at the implications of the Chinese annexation of Tibet. 1. Loss of strategic buffer. Tibet ceased to exist as a buffer between India and China. India suddenly acquired a long, exposed, and undefined land frontier. The Himalayas were no longer a political or strategic shield. 2. Military and security consequences. The PLA gained unrestricted access to the Tibetan plateau. China built roads, airfields, and logistics bases, transforming Tibet into a springboard for future military pressure on India. 3. Loss of intelligence and situational awareness. India gradually withdrew its presence from Tibet, resulting in loss of early warning and ground-level intelligence. Monitoring Chinese military buildup became extremely difficult. 4. Boundary and sovereignty challenges. China began questioning inherited boundary alignments. The McMahon Line and boundaries in Ladakh were disputed, laying the foundation for prolonged confrontation. Now friends, let us connect this episode with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, because Tibet is one of the clearest examples of how modern conflict actually unfolds. Chapter: Seeking Rules of Victory. India chose restraint, moral positioning, and avoidance of escalation even at the cost of strategic loss. China used force selectively to alter the balance permanently and ignored norms once objectives were achieved. The lesson is clear. Victory lies in outcomes, not restraint. 10,000 methods combined as one. India separated diplomacy from defense preparedness. China integrated military action with long-term political strategy, aligning territorial control with future military leverage. The lesson from unrestricted warfare is decisive. Integrated national power determines success. So officers, the annexation of Tibet stands as one of the most consequential strategic moments in India's history. It shows how decisions taken in the name of restraint can quietly reshape the balance of power for decades. Friends, here we come to the end of part 1. By now, you should have read the book at least once, and you must be referring to some notes for your preparation. Here is a simple test for yourself. If you are able to answer these questions clearly from the notes you have, then your notes are perfect. If not, then it is time to switch your notes. We have made a sincere effort to link every single answer with the relevance of unrestricted warfare, something that is rarely done but is extremely important from an examination point of view. If you want structured, exam-oriented notes that help you think, analyze, and write better answers, come and join us. Be a part of our success team. To all our subscribers, you will receive these notes in soft copy. If you wish to book our notes, feel free to call on the number shown on your screen. You can book them in soft copy and hard copy as well. Thank you for watching. Stay focused, stay consistent, and we will see you in part 2. Jai Hind.